If we had to compile a list of favourite Bible verses, one verse which would come near the top of the list is Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Apparently, after John 3:16, that verse from Philippians is often the most searched verse on the internet. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Now, I think that instinctively we normally do approach this verse the right way. I guess that there are very few people who would take this verse to mean that when they trust in Christ and believe something in their heart, they will be able to do whatever they set their mind to accomplish, like fly to the moon or break all of Usain Bolt's sprinting records. If you're familiar with the children's musical Bugsy Malone, you may recall the song that says, "We could have been anything that we wanted to be." Well, it doesn't actually work out that way, does it? Philippians chapter 4 verse 13 is a marvellous and precious Bible verse, and there are a couple of things about it worth focusing on for a moment or two, which may help us to appreciate its value all the more. The first thing is to look at the word translated as do. I can do all things. The word used doesn't actually mean do. And I really don't know why the majority of Bible versions translate it this way. The word comes 27 other times in the New Testament, and we won't find the word do as a translation in any of those places, in the version we use at St. Botolph's, or in any other of the major versions of the Bible. The word really means to be strong, powerful, able to prevail over. For example, in Acts 19:20, we read, "So the word of the Lord continued to increase and prevail mightily." That's the same word being used. We might be familiar with Paul's words in Romans 8:37. "No, in all these things," meaning adversities of various kinds, "we are more than conquerors through him who loved us." Actually, that verse goes a very long way to telling us what Philippians 4:13 does mean when it says, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." The other thing to help us is the context of the verse in Paul's letter to Philippians. It's always a very important thing to do, isn't it, when we read the Bible, to read every verse within the bigger context. Here's a quotation from a book about how to read the Bible. What would one think of a man who receives a 5-page letter from his fiancée on Monday and decides to read only the 3rd page on that day, the last page on Thursday, the first page 2 weeks later, and so on? We're all aware of the fact that reading a letter in such a piecemeal fashion would likely create nothing but confusion. So what is the context of Philippians 4:13? Well, let me just explain briefly. The big context is that Paul is writing to Christians in Philippi, a church that Paul himself had planted. He had visited the church at least 3 times before writing this letter to them. The church was very generous in their giving. When Paul wrote this letter, he was under house arrest. In fact, Paul recognised that death might be the outcome of his imprisonment. We know that verse in chapter 1, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." But although Paul recognises his situation was serious, he also anticipated the possibility of soon being released. So the big context tells us about some good things and some less good things. When we come to the narrower context of Philippians 4:13, we discover more about the all things of that verse. In the previous 2 verses, Paul has just written, "Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need." And then he continues with verse 13, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." And the all things are quite specifically the any and every circumstance that Paul has just been writing about. Some of them good, some of them extremely difficult. Because Paul was in Christ, which is true of every Christian, Paul was receiving sufficient strength to persevere. The secret of Paul's contentment regardless of his situation, was to rest in the strength that Christ provides. In other words, the secret was that he didn't do all these things. Christ did them through him. I do hope that these last few minutes have helped us to enter a bit more fully into this marvellous verse, Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. And to round off, let me give you a couple of versions of the verse which give the sense rather more clearly. Here's Young's literal translation. For all things I have strength in Christ's strengthening me. And here is J.B. Phillips's paraphrase. I am ready for anything through the strength of the one who lives within me.